All right, how's it going, pace setters? So we just are getting back from spring break, and we have roughly 7-8 weeks left of school. Hopefully you did something over the break and you kind of got a little reset there. But now we're back to the grind. So Monday, you guys were working on the close read for Chapter 10, Section 1. And today we are going to be looking at Section 2. So Section 2 is all about compromises fail. And we're going to start to see that in this period of time from 1850 to 1860, that things are kind of starting to go downhill, and there's going to be some conflicts that lead to the eventual Civil War. Now, before we get there, though, let's just kind of recap Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 was all about westward expansion and manifest destiny. And if you take a look here at the map, you'll notice that we've done it. We've achieved manifest destiny. So the Louisiana Purchase is all that territory is gained from Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Eventually Florida from Spain. Texas fights their war for independence, and then we annex them along with the Oregon Country and that treaty we signed with Britain. And then we fight the Mexican-American War, and we gain the Mexican Cession. And then that little strip there as well, we're going to eventually buy from Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase. But now what? Now what happens to all of that land out west? Is that land going to eventually become free states? Is that land going to eventually become slave states? That's really the issue now on the table. And it is why we are going to go down this path towards eventual war. In this section, we're looking at 4 very important events along this path to Civil War in 1861. Now, the first that we're going to be looking at is the Compromise of 1850. So, Compromise of 1850, it is something that is constructed by the great compromiser Henry Clay, along with the 2 other notable men in the House of Representatives at the time, Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun. Now, the compromise has 5 provisions, and the first is something that is beneficial to the North. So, California, 49ers, the gold rush happening in 1849. It is a territory at this point in time that is there's quite a few settlers out there, and it's a good land grab for the North. So California, admitted as a free state, good for the North. In response, the South gets something though. They get a stronger fugitive slave law. Under this new slave law, slaves that escape to the North, they have to be returned to their masters, their owners in the South. And it's going to be a federal law that Northerners are going to despise. It's something that's going to help protect the institution of slavery in many of the Southerners' minds. We're going to come back to this fugitive slave law because it's going to be something that actually makes things worse later on down the line. The third, though, the Mexican Cession. So all that land out west, now besides California, what happens to the rest of it? Well, they are going to decide that it is open to popular sovereignty. What that means is American settlers who move into, say, where New Mexico, Arizona are today, those settlers will get to vote on whether or not that territory ends up being a slave or a free state. The fourth, Texas. Texas is in a lot of debt because of their war against Mexico for their independence. They owe quite a bit of money, and so what they do under this compromise is they are going to give up a lot of the land that they had kind of just west. There's like this weird little arm that they used to have. They're going to give that back to the federal government in exchange for $10 million, and that's why Texas looks like it does today. Has a nice clean boundary line there. So cash for Texas. And then the fifth, they're going to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of people in the North who find it despicable that slaves are still being auctioned off and sold in the nation's capital. And so this is another issue that is resolved in the Compromise of 1850. So just a recap here. Compromise of 1850. For the North, California is going to be admitted as a free state. Good for them. For the South, stronger fugitive slave law. Again, this is going to be controversial, but good for the South. In those New Mexico territories out west, it is open to popular sovereignty. This means that settlers who move into this land, they are the ones who will decide whether or not it becomes an eventual slave or free state out there. And then Texas giving up land for money, and the slave trade being abolished in Washington, D.C. So again, the first event here of this section 2 of chapter 10, the Compromise of 1850, know it. Now, Compromise in 1850, everything looks great, right? Wrong. 10 years later, Civil War. People are going to fight each other, North and South, American against American, brothers against brothers. And so the next few events here, again, leading up to this conflict. Compromise of 1850, as I had mentioned, it was supposed to end these issues over slavery, but it really just heightens it. It's really going to be the last compromise before things just get so out of control that weapons are taken up and people are killing each other. And again, as I said, the stronger fugitive slave law is just something that really just added fuel to the fire over this issue of slavery, because you have Southerners who say, hey, this is the law that's supposed to tell Northerners they must respect this institution of slavery. But to the North, they're upset. They're upset because fugitive slaves, or I should say African Americans in the North who are even accused of being fugitive slaves, they will have to go before a federal judge. They are not being tried by a jury of their peers. They are being tried by a federal judge, and in many cases, the judge is going to rule that they need to be returned. So what you have is there's instances where you might be a free African American, and someone might just simply accuse you of being a slave, and then you get basically kidnapped and taken to the South, and you become a slave. So many in the North, these abolitionists up there, they are going to start finding loopholes around this. They're going to pass what are called personal liberty laws. States like Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, New York, they're going to pass these laws that basically guarantee if you are accused of being a fugitive slave, you don't go before a federal judge. You are tried by a jury of your peers. And it's a way to kind of get around this fugitive slave law. And it's going to outrage many in the South, because it's a de facto nullification. It doesn't just get rid of the fugitive slave law, but it basically makes it a moot point, and really it's not going to do anything. Now, in response to this, another key event is going to be the publication of a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is the daughter of abolitionist parents in the North, and she decides she's going to write a novel, a fictionalized novel, depicting an African-American slave in the South, Uncle Tom, who is just beaten and harassed and brutalized by his white master. And it's going to be a novel that really shows the horrors of slavery. And it's crucial because it ends up becoming a bestseller in the North, and it kind of gives Northerners who might not have been exposed to the dangers of slavery, and it's going to show them what it actually looks like to be a slave. And why it's important is books cause us to rethink, right? So when 20, 30 years ago, when you thought of, for example, of what a vampire was, you might have thought of Dracula, right? Or that's what I always think of a vampire, right? This creepy figure, fangs, sucks people's bloods, has talons. Look at his creepy hands there. But what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years? Well, you have TV shows, movies, things like Twilight that have changed our view on vampires, right? I'm sure a lot of you, when I said vampire, the image in your mind was some vampire from Vampire Diaries or Twilight. Maybe it was Edward. These vampires who, when they walk in the sunlight, they glitter and they glow and they're romantic. And so books can cause us to rethink, and Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to do this. It's going to cause people to rethink about this issue of slavery. Now, in the election of 1852, the Democrats are going to put up a candidate, Franklin Pierce, against General Winfield Scott. He's from the Whig Party. And Franklin Pierce is going to win. So Franklin Pierce, also known to some as Handsome Frank, he has a nice set of hair there. He becomes the 14th president. He's from New Hampshire. And notice he only serves one term. And that's because things don't go that great during his 4 years in office, as we will see. And Franklin Pierce, he really wins because he's what we call a dough-face politician. He's kind of soft on certain issues. So he's a northern politician. He's from the north, from New Hampshire, so he gains support from northerners. But then he's soft on issues like slavery. So he also gets the support from the South. So hence why he wins the majority of the electoral vote. Now, the issue of slavery in the West doesn't end, right? So in the West, the issue of slavery is really being fought over by two groups. You have Free Soilers and the Free Soil Political Party. Their stance is this: hey, we don't want to see slavery expand into the Western territories, but we're also not saying we should ban slavery altogether. So slavery can still exist in the southern states. We just don't want to see it spread to the West. And then obviously you have the Southerners who are advocating for the spreading of slavery everywhere, to the north, to the west, wherever it can go in the United States. And so this issue in the West is still ongoing. And just for clarity here, there's this political cartoon of depicting what it's like to be a free soiler. So notice the caption at the bottom. It says, "Forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler." And you have the white man here. This is a free soiler, and he has his head pulled back. And what's happening? He has a little African-American man being forced down his throat, right? And who's doing this to this free soiler? You have these northern abolitionist Democrats who are kind of saying to free soilers, we need to end slavery. You need to be on our side. Now, when I look at this political cartoon, to me, the victim of all of this is the African-American man here, right? He's the one who's in the most harm. But to a free soiler, he is the one who is the victim because he is okay with slavery existing in the South. He doesn't want to end slavery. He just wants a white West. He doesn't want to see slavery expand to those Western territories, which is going to lead to issues such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a piece of legislation passed by a Senator, Stephen Douglas, in 1854. And it's going to be quite controversial because what it does is opens up the Kansas and Nebraska territories to popular sovereignty. Now, why it's controversial is 30 years ago in 1820, Henry Clay had made, again, the great compromiser, made a compromise that stated that that land in Nebraska and Kansas is actually supposed to be dedicated to becoming free states. And we can see here in this map of what the Missouri Compromise says. So the Missouri Compromise says the land here, highlighted in green, anything north of this red line has to become free states. Now, anything lower, anything south, can become a slave state. 30 years later, though, Stephen Douglas says in the Kansas-Nebraska Act that actually the Nebraska and Kansas territory, it's open to popular sovereignty. So settlers who end up moving here, they are the ones who will decide the status of slavery in these areas. And so it's going to be very, very controversial. And those in the North are going to be furious at Stephen Douglas, especially because Stephen Douglas is from the North. He's from Illinois. And so you would think that he would have a strong stance against slavery, but he has presidential aspirations. And so he knows that he's eventually going to need the support of the Southerners. And so he's hesitant to kind of turn his back to them. because the Kansas and Nebraska territories are open to popular sovereignty now, there is going to be a conflict in this area. And this conflict eventually becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. So Bleeding Kansas is something that there are quite actually a few historians who believe this to be the first action of the Civil War. And it's because what happens is this: when that territory is now open to popular sovereignty, you have settlers, pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, who begin pouring into Kansas, right? And we call these individuals border ruffians. So these border ruffians causing a commotion, crossing the border, going into the territory because they want to make this Kansas territory an eventual slave state. But guess what? They're not the only ones. There are free staters, anti-slavery settlers from New England. They too begin to move and relocate in this Kansas territory. And guess what happens? They don't get along. And over 4 years, we're going to see that nearly 56 individuals are going to die from these different skirmishes that the two sides have. In fact, one of the more notable is the sacking of this city of Lawrence, an anti-slavery settlement. Pro-slavery settlers come in, attack this city. Now, there's always a reaction. So John Brown, a man that you should keep in the back of your mind. John Brown, you can see with his crazy eyes, his big powerful beard there. He's an abolitionist, and he's one of those abolitionists who he'd rather take up his rifle, or in this case his broadsword, and use violence as a way to try and end slavery. And John Brown specifically here, he, in retaliation to the sacking of Lawrence, is going to go to Potawatomi Creek, where there's a pro-slavery settlement, and he is actually going to just kill many of the pro-slavery settlers there, he and a few men, and he's going to take his broadsword, and as the story goes, he's going to just hack them to pieces. Now, John Brown, we'll see more of him in the future, but you can see him here in this painting. It's a fairly famous painting, and John Brown there in the middle, with his crazy eyes and his beard flowing in the wind. He's got the rifle, the Bible in the other hand. You can see the tornadoes and fire. It looks like chaos is happening in Kansas. And as I said, there are some that believe this to be the beginnings of the Civil War, because you can see you have kind of the American flag here, and on the other side you have the Confederate battle flag of the South on the other, with bodies on the floor. And so again, depicting this portion of history called Bleeding Kansas. Now, in addition to violence, just physical violence, there's also conflict in this territory over politics, right? So both sides, anti and pro-slavery sides, they each are attempting to create Kansas, the state of Kansas, and they begin to submit these countering constitutions, state constitutions. And so even up to the Civil War, this is going on. Now, we also see that with Franklin Pierce's victory in the presidential election over the Whig candidate, Winfield Scott, it's actually going to be the demise of a very prominent political party. The Whig Party put quite a few presidents into office. So we see the Whig Party kind of dissipate and break up. Pour some out for our man Henry Clay here, rest in peace. He doesn't die, but his political party fails. Again, remember, Clay ran for president 3 times, failed. All 3 of those, took the 3 L's. But we're going to see those politicians who are part of the Whig Party, they don't disappear. They just join different political groups. So we're going to see that the northern and southern Whigs kind of separate geographically. So the northern Whigs are going to start to side with some of the political parties up north, while the South with the Democrats down there. Now, this leads really to the formation of the Republican Party that we know of today. So the Republican Party of Donald Trump, of George W. Bush, of Abraham Lincoln, it is founded in the demise of the Whig Party, and it's founded in 1854. Now, It is a combination of these northern Whigs and free soil Democrats. Now, the Republican Party, we need to understand this. They are about free soil, but they are not abolitionists. So the Republican Party, they do not want to see slavery expand to the West, but they also are not advocating for the ending of slavery in the South. So that's their stance here going forward. And then the last little section here, last incident I want to talk about in this section is the Brooks-Sumner Incident. So things are not good by 1856. We're going to see that the violence in Kansas, it actually is going to lead to violence on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., in the Senate chamber itself. And we're going to see Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner throwing hands. So what ends up happening is this. Senator Charles Sumner, he is from Massachusetts. He's an abolitionist. And what he does is on the Senate floor, amongst his fellow senators, he issues a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. He gives this fiery speech just disrespecting at times Andrew Butler, another senator from South Carolina, just ripping him to shreds, calling him bad names. And he even goes beyond that. He gives this speech that truly rips him apart, and it is unprecedented. Usually at this point in time, American politics, if you were a senator or a member in the House, the president, you were expected to be a gentleman. You were supposed to respect your fellow congressmen. But this is the first time where we see Charles Sumner really just go after someone. And he goes even beyond that. He goes and he publishes his speech in the newspapers in the North so that the American citizens can hear what he had said. This doesn't go over very well in the South or with South Carolina in particular. And what we see is this. While Andrew Butler was on the receiving end of these words, his cousin, Preston Brooks, who is actually in the House of Representatives for South Carolina, he is a gentleman and he feels that he and his family have been disrespected. And there's kind of this chivalrous act in his mind that he must defend his family and the South. And so he wants to actually challenge Charles Sumner to a duel. He literally wants to walk 10 paces, turn around and shoot at each other. But he has a few buddies who say, hey, that's not the best idea. So what does Preston Brooks do? The next best thing in his mind. He is going to walk into the Senate chamber and he is going to nearly beat Charles Sumner half to death with a cane. So walks in and just starts whacking him, just beating him up on the Senate floor. And you can see Charles Sumner here. He's got his head bloodied. The cane has some blood here as well. You have the people kind of in the back smiling, some of them showing such just disgust at what's going on. So things are so bad in the country that we are now seeing these senators fighting one another on the floor of Congress. Now, Preston Brooks, he's obviously going to be vilified by the North. They're going to look at Brooks and say, typical Southerner, that's the way we expect them to act. But in the South, Preston Brooks, he's going to be a hero, right? He's going to become an icon of what it means to be a Southerner, and they're going to love him for it. And the story goes that Preston Brooks was actually sent Minnie a cane in the mail, and that on one of the handles of the canes, one of the people who sent it had etched in, hit him again on the cane. So again, that's where the country's at by 1856. Things are just really, really messed up. Now, when it comes around for the presidential election, again, we're going to see that the Democratic Party, they actually are not even going to renominate their presidential candidate already in office, Franklin Pierce. They're just going to say, nah, we're going to go a different way. So that's kind of where we're at here in section 2. Now, going forward here for section 3 of this chapter, there's a few more events here. The Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. John Brown, our guy, is back and raiding weapon facilities in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. And then the final kind of straw that breaks the camel's back, Lincoln is going to be elected in 1860, and that is when we're going to start to see some of those southern states secede and the Civil War begin.